It was near the Cambodian border on the 18th of May, 1967, when a platoon of American soldiers walked directly into an ambush, prepared by a much larger enemy force. They were quickly surrounded, cut off from other platoons, and overrun. The relief force that reached the scene the next day watched in horror at what remained of the 30-man patrol. 19 were lying dead and 7 wounded. However, one man couldn't be found anywhere, dead or alive. It was Private First Class Joe DeLong, the M60 machine gunner. He was listed as missing in action for years, until long after the war, the real truth was revealed. And what had happened to him would be nothing short of a horror story. However, he wasn't the only one, as you're about to hear what the Viet Cong did to captured M60 gunners. Okay, so now that you'd understand better why the M60 was so hated, beloved, or feared, depending on who you ask, let's first say a word or two about it, because its story is quite interesting. It was developed in the period after World War II, when Americans looked at their machine guns and realized what a pile of garbage they were compared to German ones. Even worse, the American military never actually used their machine guns as the Germans did. They were seen more as a supporting element, not as the main source of a squad's firepower, unlike the Germans, where every soldier worked around the 3-man machine gun team to protect them, and they in turn protected the squad with heavy automatic fire. I'm talking here, of course, about the legendary MG-42 and its older, overlooked brother, the MG-34. Now, in the post-war years, the Americans had an even bigger problem because their infantry weapons still weren't standardized. Frontline units were juggling different rifles, carbines, submachine guns, and several types of Browning machine guns instead of one common system. Now look at this. All these weapons were mixed up within each infantry squad, and they all needed to be resupplied with at least 4 different calibers delivered to each squad on the front line. Not to mention that you would have to produce so many different weapons and accessories for it, and then train soldiers to use all of them. So, logically, now as the Second World War ended and the Cold War began, hinting at the new global conflict with the Soviet Union, Americans were working on standardizing and improving their weaponry. Among others that are not the topic of this video, there came the M60 General Purpose Machine Gun in the new NATO standardized 7.62 by 51 caliber. It might not look like it, but it's actually a combination of the German MG-42 machine gun and FG-42 paratroop rifle. They took the elements they liked from both of them and glued them together with some American innovations, and voila, the M60 was born. Okay, it wasn't so simple or easy, but you're not here to listen about development and prototypes. It was now issued to the American units, and the squad was also organized following German World War II doctrine with their 3-man machine gun team. In anticipation of war with the Soviet Union, American units were going through heavy training with their weapon, but its debut in combat would be far from where they first expected it to be. It was the Vietnam War where the M60 would earn its divided reputation, ranging from being the best gun, saving soldiers' lives in countless firefights, to being deemed absolute junk that soldiers tried to get rid of every chance they got. Before we go into what happened to the M60 gunners, take a look at what they did in Vietnam, and it'll be more clear to you why the enemy hated it so much. At first, only special forces teams were trying M60s out, and had a high opinion of them compared to the older bulky machine guns they had. But when the war escalated in the mid-1960s, and from then on, every infantry squad and platoon, and soon helicopters, jeeps, trucks, tanks, and fighting vehicles were likely to have at least one M60. But our focus is people who carried it into the jungle on foot. And because of this, the M60 got its nickname, the Pig, despite weighing 23 pounds empty, being one of the lightest machine guns of its class, weighing some 10 pounds less than the previous M1919. But it's understandable that it became quite heavy once you'd be carrying it through the jungle and rice paddies on a several days-long patrol in a tropical climate. And keep in mind that the machine gun's weight was the least of the soldiers' problems, because that machine gun needed something to fire. Firing some 600 rounds per minute, it means that a 100-round belt would be out in some 10 seconds, and you'd never know for how long the engagements might last and how strong an enemy force you could encounter. Because of this, soldiers always carried as much ammo for the M60 as possible, with every man sacrificing some weight in his personal equipment to carry 1 or 2 belts for the M60. They had these cold-blooded calculations before setting out on a mission on what they needed the most, and what was more likely to save their lives in battle. For example, flak jackets were mostly left back at base in favor of additional ammo, as they provided no protection against bullets. Only from shrapnel and ammunition, especially for the machine gun, is much better protection. The standard infantry rifle M16 first had its debacle early in the war with horribly frequent jams and malfunctions, and its 5.56 round struggled to go through thick vegetation. M60, on the other hand, didn't have this problem, so the ammo for it was prioritized. But carrying all the equipment and ammo quickly climbed up to 80 pounds of weight soldiers needed to carry on their backs. A 100-round belt for the M60 weighed some 7 pounds, and each platoon would carry a couple thousand for their M60, especially the ammo bearer with his least fun job in the team. Beside him was the assistant gunner, carrying spare barrels, additional ammo, sometimes also the tripod, and of course the gunner, who would soon turn out to be one of the most vulnerable men in the platoon, and you're now going to see why. Already in the first bigger engagements, the M60 showed what it could do. The tactic was that when the platoon was inevitably ambushed by North Vietnamese guerrillas, the M60 gunner would immediately open fire in the direction of the ambush and position himself at the front of the squad to protect them. It was quite effective at keeping enemy heads down and blasting them through the jungle cover. So logically, they quickly understood that if they wanted to overrun an American squad, they needed to get rid of the M60s first, preferably as soon as possible, so they'd avoid its return fire. They were easily recognized by the distinctive big black weapon they carried, and if possible, they would be hit first when the ambush was sprung. If not, their distinctive firing sound and the cloud of dust it kicked up when firing from the ground would reveal their position immediately and attract all the fire, RPGs, mortars, and grenades the enemy had at that location. That is why there's a saying that M60 gunners had a life expectancy of 7 seconds after pulling the trigger in a firefight. It's perhaps not the most accurate number in the world, but surely not a pleasant thing to hear when handed your new weapon and assignment. If they wanted to stay alive longer than that, they had to switch position, fire as much as they could to suppress or neutralize the enemy, or allow the rest of the squad to maneuver according to the battle's conditions. Some M60 gunners got very creative and began modifying their weapon to work better, like wiring tin C ration cans to guide the belt better into the gun, or even attaching the feeding chute they'd take from downed helicopters, then connect it to an old radio backpack and load inside several 100-round belts into one continuous long belt of up to 1,000 rounds. It would be quite heavy, but you'd not need to worry about reloading, and you could spray the jungle as long as jams, runaway, or barrel overheating didn't stop you. Oh yeah, by the way, the M60 had the tendency to sometimes quote-unquote run away, meaning that due to a worn-out trigger mechanism, it wouldn't stop firing when the trigger was released, but would continue in full auto as long as the ammo wasn't spent, or someone yanked and twisted the belt to stop it from feeding. Its quick-change barrel system wasn't so quick and practical in the field, and for some reason, they didn't copy the effective system the MG42 had. Early versions of the M60 didn't even have any handle to grab the hot barrel, but the assistant or gunner had to grab it with an asbestos cloth or glove, then twist it and detach it, and then put the fresh one on. So, as you can imagine, doing this in the middle of a firefight wasn't the easiest job in the world, and severe burns to assistants were not rare. They'd improvise with wire from coat hangers to make these handles before handles were introduced on the improved versions later, along with other upgrades. Oh, and while we speak about the improvisations, before we reveal what happened to the M60 gunner mentioned at the beginning of the video, and then we tell you another story of a captured M60 operator who earned the Medal of Honor, let's just look at this thing for a second. Special forces conducting long-range reconnaissance patrols in Vietnam were modifying M60s in perhaps the most severe ways, and this is one of them. They'd chop off the stock and barrel to save weight and make it more compact, then do that trick with the radio backpack, loaded with hundreds of rounds and fed to the gun. This way, the small recon team had a guy who'd carry this and serve as a chaos creator if they were compromised deep in enemy territory. Recons worked in small teams of between 4 and 10 people, and if they were discovered by a much larger enemy force, they'd all open fire from all weapons, while the gunner with his everything but normal-looking M60 would stand up, open fire, and turn in circles, firing in all directions. The shortened barrel created a bright flash and much louder noise, and firing in such a way it gave the impression of a much larger force than a small recon team. It would confuse the enemy to buy them a chance to escape, and it actually worked a couple of times. Now, when you know the real story of the machine gun, let's continue with what actually happened to Private First Class Joe DeLong. When his platoon was overrun and obliterated, and the next day the relief force arrived, there wasn't a sign of the enemy, nor of DeLong or his machine gun. It was presumed he was either killed and the body couldn't be found, or perhaps captured alive. Years went by, and no one found out anything about him until years after the war ended. Some of the American prisoners of war came home and told a story that turned out much darker than anyone could expect. American POWs, captured in the same general time frame, said that DeLong had been taken alive when the perimeter fell. He had been marched into the extensive informal prison camp system along the border areas between Vietnam and Cambodia, in remote compounds where many captured American soldiers went through. According to POWs who returned home and gave debriefs, DeLong, like all of them, was enduring the horrible treatment and conditions in these camps and wanted to attempt escape. On November 6, 1967, months after he was reported missing, DeLong and several other American prisoners executed their escape plan. By some accounts, they clubbed and overpowered a guard, took his weapon, and broke out into the jungle. Prisoners who remained in the camp could hear gunfire later that day, and after some time saw the escapees being brought back. Their attempt had failed. However, one of them was missing, and it was DeLong again. Some accounts say he was shot while resisting recapture, which would align with the report of a seized guard's weapon. If he was the only one armed, that could explain why he was shot. It wasn't confirmed. The rest of the prisoners only saw his trousers brought back, riddled with bullet holes and soaked with blood, making it obvious that DeLong wasn't coming back. Years after the war, the accumulation of such testimonies led to changing his status from missing in action to death in captivity. But still, his body was never found, and the truth of his last moments is buried with him somewhere in the jungle. He was posthumously promoted to Staff Sergeant. We also have to tell the story of Special Forces Staff Sergeant John Caviani, and although he was not a designated M60 gunner, he would become one when his remote radio post in enemy-held territory was surrounded and attacked. He would be wounded and captured in the end, but what he did and what happened to him later just must be told. So Caviani was leading a small security platoon at a remote radio relay site at the so-called Hickory Hill. It was deep in enemy territory, and they knew the attack was just a matter of time, and they were right. On June 4, 1971, the morning erupted with heavy fire from all around the post. Small arms, machine guns, RPGs, and grenades were raining down on the men desperately trying to hold the perimeter against a much larger Viet Cong force determined to wipe them out. Caviani ran from position to position, returned fire, threw grenades, and led his men, making sure the defense was holding up. Realizing the force surrounding them was much larger, they requested immediate evacuation with helicopters. As the day went on, Caviani directed the fire and the helicopters coming in for extraction. 3 helicopters took out most of the platoon, but Caviani remained on the ground to fight with the remaining men. Because of heavy fire, now directed at the helicopters, they couldn't extract the rest of the soldiers, and the men on the ground had to stay at the outpost overnight, desperately trying to push the enemy back. Caviani took over an M60 and laid heavy suppressive fire, preventing the outpost from being overrun. They held out until the morning, but the helicopters still couldn't come in due to heavy fog, which the enemy exploited to attack. They pushed in 2 ranks, the first laying down heavy small arms fire and the second throwing a barrage of hand grenades. Caviani realized they couldn't hold up and ordered his men to slip out while he covered their retreat. He took the M60, stood up, completely exposing himself to enemy fire, and swept the machine gun across the advancing enemy ranks, mowing them down and inflicting heavy casualties. He was severely wounded multiple times, and he continued fighting until he was taken out. But he didn't die then. He was captured alive, and now the darkest chapter of his life began. He was dragged far into enemy territory. He wouldn't be given any medical care. He was beaten and interrogated, and he saw fellow captured Americans being executed in front of him or dying from the horrible treatment in remote improvised prison camps. However, with horrible shrapnel wounds and a bullet in his body, he somehow survived for almost 2 years in captivity, treating his wounds the best he could. In 1973, he was released and finally arrived home in Operation Homecoming, in horrible condition, weighing barely 90 pounds, but still alive. For protecting his men and his last stand at that radio outpost, he received the Medal of Honor.